I realized I was lonely while sitting next to my own husband, not because he left, but because he stayed and slowly erased me. This isn't about infidelity, it's about being reduced to a presence while still being married. Loneliness isn't silence, it's being heard and still ignored. I shared a home, a bed, a life with my husband, and yet I existed like background noise. No shouting, no bruises, no obvious cruelty, just distance disguised as normalcy, control disguised as concern, a marriage where I was present but never included. This is how I learned that betrayal doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it settles in quietly and waits for you to disappear. In the beginning, there was nothing obviously wrong. He came home on time, he slept beside me, he asked surface-level questions that sounded like concern if you didn't listen too closely. How was your day? Did you eat? You should rest more. But he never waited for the answers. I learned quickly that my words had no weight. They floated between us and disappeared, so I stopped offering them freely. I started summarizing my life into sentences that required no response. He preferred it that way. Whenever I tried to talk about something that mattered, my exhaustion, my confusion, the quiet sadness I couldn't explain, his tone would shift. Calm, rational, slightly disappointed. You're overthinking. You're too sensitive. This isn't a real problem. There was no argument to fight against, no anger to react to, just dismissal delivered gently enough to make me doubt myself. Over time, I began rehearsing conversations in my head before speaking. I filtered my emotions, I adjusted my expressions. I learned which versions of myself were acceptable and which ones caused silence. Silence was his favorite weapon. If I questioned him, the room would go cold. He wouldn't shout, he wouldn't leave. He would simply withdraw, his attention, his warmth, his acknowledgement. Days could pass like that. We would eat at the same table, sleep in the same bed, and exist as strangers. I blamed myself. Maybe I was demanding too much. Maybe marriage was supposed to feel like this. Maybe this was just adulthood. Slowly, my world began shrinking. I stopped sharing things with friends because I didn't want to explain my marriage. I stopped doing things I enjoyed because they felt pointless without someone noticing. I became efficient, quiet, easy to live with. He praised that version of me. "You're calmer now," he once said. "I like you better this way." I didn't realize it then, but that was the moment something in me went numb. Because love isn't supposed to reward your disappearance. And yet, I was being trained to vanish, politely, silently, without leaving a mark. The rules were never spoken. That was the cruelty of them. I learned them by watching his reactions, what made his jaw tighten, what made him go silent, what earned me that look of mild irritation that felt worse than anger. If I dressed too carefully, he'd ask who I was trying to impress. If I dressed too simply, he'd suggest I had stopped trying. If I laughed too loudly, I was embarrassing. If I stayed quiet, I was boring. There was no version of me that was correct for long. He started correcting me in small ways. The tone of my voice, the way I phrased things, the timing of my questions. You don't have to say it like that. You're reading into it again. You're imagining things. Each sentence landed softly, reasonably, like advice, and each one erased a little more of my confidence. I began apologizing for things I hadn't done, for moods he caused, for discomfort he denied. At night, lying beside him, I felt like an intruder in my own marriage. He would scroll through his phone while I stared at the ceiling, counting the seconds between his breaths. Sometimes he smiled at the screen. He never smiled like that at me anymore. I didn't ask why. I had learned that questions were dangerous. Whenever I tried to get closer, emotionally, physically, he would stiffen slightly. Not enough to accuse him of rejection, just enough to make me pull away first. That was his pattern. Make me retreat, then accuse me of being distant. "You're not the same anymore," he said once, shaking his head like I'd disappointed him. "I miss how you used to be." I wanted to scream that he had changed me, that I was reacting, not transforming, but the words stayed trapped in my throat. I had learned that expressing pain only made him colder. So I adapted. I monitored myself constantly, my expressions, my tone, my needs. I became hyper-aware of his moods and completely disconnected from my own. That's when the loneliness deepened, because even in the same room, I was alone with my thoughts, and he made sure they stayed there. It happened on an ordinary evening. That's how most breaking points arrive. Quiet, unannounced. We were sitting together on the couch. The television was on, volume low, something he liked and I tolerated. Our shoulders almost touched. Anyone looking at us would have thought we were comfortable, familiar, married. I felt empty. I tried to speak. Something small, something harmless. I don't even remember what it was. A comment, an observation, an attempt to exist. He didn't respond. Not immediately, not at all. His eyes stayed on the screen. His body didn't shift. It was as if sound had stopped reaching him. After a few seconds, I realized he had hurt me. He had just decided I wasn't worth acknowledging. That was when it clicked. I wasn't lonely because we had grown apart. I was lonely because he had decided I no longer required presence. I watched his reflection in the dark screen. Calm, relaxed, completely at ease in my absence. And something inside me broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but cleanly. I stopped reaching for him after that. When he stayed late, I didn't ask where he'd been. When he forgot things that mattered to me, I told myself they didn't matter either. When he spoke over me, I let him finish. The strange part was how relieved he seemed. Our home grew quieter. Tension disappeared, not because things improved, but because I stopped resisting. He mistook my withdrawal for maturity, peace. "This is better," he said once. "We don't fight anymore." He was right. I had nothing left to defend. That night, lying beside him, I stared at the ceiling and realized something terrifying. If I disappeared tomorrow, his life wouldn't change. The routine would remain intact. The silence would be uninterrupted. I had become replaceable without ever being replaced. And that was the cruelest betrayal of all. Not another woman, not an affair, but the slow realization that I had been emotionally removed from my own marriage long before I noticed. I was sitting next to him when I understood it. I was already alone. I didn't leave immediately. That's the part people don't understand. They assume awareness leads to action, that once you see the damage, you escape. But psychological erosion doesn't end with clarity. It ends when there's nothing left to sacrifice. I stayed because leaving felt dramatic, and I had been trained to minimize my pain. I stayed because he wasn't cruel enough to justify walking away. I stayed because the world would ask questions I wasn't strong enough to answer. So I remained quiet. He continued as he always had, detached, controlled, unaffected. He didn't notice my withdrawal because it benefited him. I required less effort, less explanation, less accountability. Sometimes I would watch him talk to others, engaged, animated, attentive. The man I married still existed, just not with me. That realization settled deep in my chest. I stopped hoping for change. Hope had become exhausting. Instead, I observed. I measured how often he dismissed me, how quickly he shut down conversations, how easily he rewrote reality to suit himself. "You're remembering it wrong. That's not what I meant. You always twist things." Over time, I stopped trusting my own memory. That was when I understood the cost. Not loneliness, not sadness, but erosion. My instincts dulled, my reactions slowed. I questioned myself before I questioned him. I learned to disappear while remaining physically present. And then, one day, sitting beside him again, I felt nothing. No anger, no longing, no sadness. Just clarity. Staying had taught him I would tolerate absence. Staying had taught me I was optional. That was the moment I realized loneliness wasn't the problem, it was the symptom. The real damage was how small I had allowed myself to become in order to survive him. I didn't need proof of betrayal. I was living inside it. If this story felt uncomfortable, that wasn't accidental. Some wounds don't leave marks. They leave silence. They teach you to doubt yourself while appearing perfectly normal to everyone else. Many people stay in relationships like this for years, not because they're weak, but because nothing looks bad enough from the outside. No shouting, no obvious betrayal, just slow erasure. If you recognized yourself in this story, know this: awareness is the first fracture, and fractures spread. This channel exists for stories that don't beg for sympathy, stories about emotional absence, psychological control, and the kind of loneliness that hides in plain sight. Subscribe not for hope, not for comfort, but to name what's often ignored. To listen to the stories people don't tell until it's too late. Because the most dangerous relationships aren't always the loud ones. They're the quiet ones you learn to survive. And survival, when prolonged, has a cost.